A huge warm welcome to Team Her Spirit. And today's conversation is all around fueling for endurance events. And who better to join us on the conversation but the wonderful Bo, who's a brand manager and chief nutritionist at our wonderful partners, VOOM. Welcome, Bo, for today's conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. And yeah, hi, Mel. Hi, Holly. It's great to be joining you. And yeah, thank you to all the kind of the community who have put some good questions forward that we're going to delve into today. Should be a great conversation.
Yeah, brilliant. I love a good nutrition conversation, Bo. I've been on my own nutrition journey over the last 6 or 7 years, and particularly around trying to feel better for endurance. So I'm particularly looking forward to this conversation. But before we dive into the specific questions that Team Hesperitus have asked, and also the kind of the nuances, if you like, around sports nutrition and supplements, I'd really just love to spend a bit of time just talking about nutrition in its own right, because I think it's often overlooked actually when we're all busy focused on our events. We're worrying about how we're going to fuel ourselves for the event itself and actually a little bit about pre and post training. But actually, in my experience, getting your nutrition right 7 days a week consistently has probably some of the biggest gains. So what's your thoughts on sort of how we should all approach our kind of day-to-day nutrition?
Yeah, it's a good point. Obviously, thinking about that race day, and perhaps we talk about carb loading, so you might start thinking about it 2 or 3 days before a big event. But that 2 or 3 days, you might spend 2 or 3 months kind of trying to prepare and train and get ready for an event. So there's so much to be gained by getting the basics right. And yeah, it's getting a good balance. As endurance athletes, carbohydrates are obviously important, supported by protein, which is kind of going to help the body repair and recover the muscles after training. If it's a real goal of the training, it can also help build muscle mass. And then, yes, some fats, obviously the healthy part of the diet. The body uses fats as on a day-to-day basis as an energy supply. It's kind of the body uses carbs as we start to exercise and up the intensity a little bit. So some fat content is important as well. So yeah, it's kind of getting a good balance of those day to day. I suppose there's a lot of talk now about avoiding ultra processed foods, which are kind of not so easily absorbed by the body. So they don't actually have as much nutritional value as natural foods, which I appreciate can sometimes be harder to prepare, a more natural based meal than reaching for perhaps a ready meal or something, a takeaway, something that's really quick and easy on the way home after, a long day of work or whatever. So yeah, and the other thing I'd like to add at this point is a lot of people kind of try and plan things out and they look at what meals they might be able to have through the week and can they forward make some of them. And then if something goes wrong, people sometimes just see it's the end of the world. That something went wrong, end up having a takeaway on Friday night, and that's the end of the diet, which I don't really like the word diet, meaning I'm trying to lose weight, which is what it normally means. Your diet is how are you going to fuel your body for the goals and your daily lifestyle that you want to lead.
Yeah, and that points around all of the components of your nutrition and your fueling. What does good look like in its percentages of? So if you use the plate, what would that look like in the ideal scenario? So that's question number one. And are there any differences between men and women in terms of consumption nutritionally? And does that change as we start to mature as wonderful women into our 50s, 60s, and beyond? So, what does that plate look like to start with, Bo?
And so, as a general guide, 50 to 60% of your kind of daily calories are likely to come from carbohydrates. That might be slightly more if you're particularly active or you're in a heavy training period, up to perhaps even 70%. And then your protein intake will be looking for anywhere from 15 to 20% of your calories to come from protein, and similar again for the fats, 15 to 20%. And again, it can depend on your athletic goals as well. If somebody's particularly involved in strength training and perhaps wants to build muscle, they perhaps need to look to increase the protein intake slightly, because those amino acids that are in protein are the building blocks of our muscles. And yeah, like, as I mentioned, more endurance based, we're burning a lot of carbohydrates. You need to kind of up the carb intake. And yeah, there's an important role for fats in the diet as well. It's an ongoing energy supply in the body. Kind of if you're at rest, or as we are, just sat perhaps working at a desk, your body's metabolizing fats all the time to give your energy and your to give your muscles and your brain that energy that's kind of produced when you break down those fats in the body. So that's probably a kind of a good overall balance. And then manipulating that, as you say, for male and female. So there's not a huge difference in those percentages. It's more the overall volume. Typically, males are going to need slightly higher calorie intake per day. But that relates largely to your body mass and your muscle mass. So, there might be a smaller male or perhaps somebody with a lower muscle mass who's not going to need as many calories per day as perhaps a larger female or perhaps a particularly muscular female, because that muscle kind of uses energy just to maintain itself day to day. So whilst that's the trend, on average, males need more per day. It's not always the absolute.
Now, Bo, I really want to just sort of explore a bit more on carbohydrates. We've had quite a number of questions related to carbohydrates, which we'll come on to. Can you just explain what the role of carbohydrates is in the diet? Because I think there's been quite a lot of sort of attention around protein. And I think certainly from the conversations we see within Team Her Spirit, the Her Spirit community, people seem to understand the benefits of protein, why you'd be doing it, particularly if you're menopausal. But I think carbohydrates is often not talked about and sometimes, or quite often, probably demonized. And I just really want to understand, what is the role of carbohydrates in our day-to-day diet? And what role do they play when you're starting to increase your training load, particularly if you're looking to do an endurance type event?
Yeah, so carbohydrates, well, both fats and carbohydrates are an energy source for the body. So essentially we consume them in our diet, and both can be stored to some extent in the body. Typically we can store a lot more fat than we can carbohydrates. So there's a finite level of carbohydrate that can be stored in the body, in the muscles and in the liver. If we keep consuming more calories, the body can essentially store more fat and create more fat cells which store fat, which have kind of come as an evolutionary tool in years gone by when we needed, at times of plenty, you just eat what you can, and then that perhaps has to last you when there's less food availability. So obviously not an issue at the moment. But as we look to do more exercise, the carbohydrate is the energy source that's kind of going to come to the fore. And that's because carbohydrates can be metabolized, which means being broken down to actually release the energy. Carbohydrates can be metabolized more easily than fats, and there's a longer series of reactions that have to take place for fat to be metabolized. And that means as you kind of start to work at a higher intensity, perhaps just moving from being sedentary to walking more, or if you're more trained, moving from walking to running, or from jogging to running fast, depending on your level, there's a point when the fat metabolism can't deliver the energy quickly enough for the body. So we start to burn the carbohydrates because they're more easily broken down to release that energy. And that's kind of what's going to fuel the body. So if you're looking to do more exercise, you're going to need to take on more carbohydrates, essentially.
Yeah, so it's really key, isn't it? And I know for myself, and we actually had a couple of ladies in Team Her Spirit this week talk about the fact that they're waking up in the night hungry. And wondering if this is related to the increase in training that they're doing. Now they're following a structured training plan, and actually a number of them probably thinking they're not probably eating enough carbs. So Mel, I wonder if we should get into some of these questions that we have, particularly around the carbohydrates.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting topic, and one asked by many is, if we kind of take the first one, and we've got numerous women doing Chase the Sun, which obviously you guys are a partner of. One of the questions is that she's thinking about stopping halfway through that to eat something that is real food rather than gels, bars, etc. But she's got a sensitive stomach. Do you think that is a good suggestion?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, because over these kind of longer endurance challenges, it becomes harder and perhaps less enjoyable to keep using kind of things that are designed as supplements, so gels, energy bars, and those sorts of snacks. So yeah, some real food mixed in on this kind of duration of event can be really good. If she, as you say, particularly suffers with a sensitive stomach, actually having a stop to take on that real food in a bit more of a meal type way is potentially a good idea. What I would definitely recommend is test it out in your training where you can. So whether that's, you're on one of your longer training rides, the cafe stop. I'm always a fan of a coffee and a cake, but cafes, you can perhaps have a sandwich, or they might do some sort of meal with rice or pasta, or, depending where you go, and you can kind of try that. You still want to be looking for carbohydrate rich foods. So yeah, things like rice, pasta, potatoes, bread, as long as you're not gluten intolerant or you're okay with bread on a day-to-day basis. And yeah, just giving yourself a little bit of time to kind of take that on board, I think could be really useful in kind of staying strong during the latter part of that ride. We talk about kind of a carbohydrate intake during, which I think we're going to come on to more in some of the questions. But perhaps you've got a figure in mind of how many grams of carbohydrate you're going to try and take on each hour. And even if you stick with that, I would not consider that kind of lunchtime meal or that proper meal as part of that. Because even if you hit your goal, you are probably almost certainly going to be depleting your carb stores a little bit. With the best will in the world, you're taking on what you can and replenishing some of them. But as you keep going, you will deplete to some extent. So I'd try and almost consider that as an extra. And then once you're back out on the bike, try and get back to your hourly intake, whether that's from a carbohydrate drink or some gels or some, flapjack bites or whatever it is that you use.
I remember that lunch stop on Chase the Sun last year. Mel and I did Chase the Sun North. And if I remember rightly, Mel, I think we had sausage roll and chips.
Yes, it wasn't the best.
But tell you what, it tasted good. And I know I can tolerate something like that. I've actually got a fairly good gut, actually, certainly for cycling. I think I've always quipped that I could probably eat a 3-course meal on my bike and be relatively okay. But and I think your point there actually about not considering that lunchtime meal as part of your overall carb intake's a really interesting one. I know by that point, it was probably about 100 miles in, wasn't it, Mel? Really was craving a proper meal. And my body was obviously saying, I want something sort of a bit more substantial to eat. Just a question on that, folks. I know from an ultra running point of view, there's quite a lot of interesting conversation about if you're doing 24-hour plus kind of races, the need to actually have some solid food and the need to actually have some fats in there to help actually the whole nutrition system kind of work. Can you just talk a little bit about that so people understand the role of, I guess, maybe a bit more solid food and why things like fats and others actually might be a good idea, dependent on the size of the event you're doing?
Yeah, on a surface level, I think there becomes a time when you don't want to just have kind of simple carbs. It's almost psychological. You just want to feel like you're eating something different. It's different textures and tastes in the mouth. But on the kind of the macronutrient level, as you say, some fats and some protein in an ultra distance are both quite beneficial. The fats are, as I mentioned, are an energy source. They're perhaps not the first thing you would think of to take during, but that's because they take slightly longer to digest. But as long as you're not taking huge quantities, some fats can help. And again, some protein, up to perhaps 25% of your hourly calories could come from protein. And what that means is you can basically have real foods. And, it's easy to look on the packet for a gel and say, oh, there's no protein, there's no fat, and there's 22 grams of carbs. It's easy to count those things. But by allowing yourself to have some protein and some fat, you can have more of a rounded meal, whether that's a sausage roll and chips, or, it might be something, rice and a mild curry with some chicken. You've kind of got a balance of macronutrients, and that, does become important over longer duration. Ideally, you want to try and avoid foods that are too high in fiber, because that can cause a bit more distress on the stomach and potentially lead to the need to go to the toilet, which is not ideal during an endurance challenge, obviously. But yeah, it's a good point there, Holly.
And to be fair to us, I would just like to just say that I think that was the only thing available to us by the time we got to that stop, Mel. Was that right?
Yeah, it was. It was washed down by a cappuccino. It's a good kind of lead into two questions that I have for you. We talked a lot about carbohydrates. How much carbohydrate should I have per hour when we talk about the amount of grams? And for this instance, women, how much carbohydrate should we be consuming if we're doing an event that is 4 hours plus?
Yeah, so the recommended research, there's a bit of a changing point, a flipping point around 2.5 to 3 hours of the duration of the event. under that time, you can get away with taking on a little bit less per hour because, yes, you become a little bit depleted, but you're going to be stopping after 2.5, 3 hours. Once you get over that sort of 3-hour mark, it's kind of, you need to be taking on a little bit more just for that projection of where you're actually going and where you're going to end up. The research recommends between 60 and 90 grams of carbs per hour if you're exercising at a moderate intensity for longer than that sort of 3-hour mark. And that, may seem like quite a lot for some people, and that's kind of an ideal case scenario. So if you're currently only, if you work out what you're doing and you have 1 gel per hour, you're perhaps taking on 20 to 25 grams of carbs per hour. If you can up that to 40, 45, 50 grams, you're going to be in a lot better position, even though you're not yet at that 60 gram sort of target. And the other point I would make here, there's a lot of research now coming out that shows you can actually, to some extent, train the gut to absorb these things more comfortably. Because a lot of people perhaps have 1 gel every half hour or every 40 minutes and think, oh, I'm not sure I could stomach much more. If that's what they always do, then that's what the body gets used to. If you can edge that up a little bit during your training rides, the body kind of becomes more efficient at absorbing that glucose from the stomach down into the small intestine and actually into the body. So you can actually edge up a little bit how much carbohydrate you can take. And that guide is 60 to 90 grams. There are people at like an elite level who are working at even higher intensity for longer periods. They're pushing beyond 90 grams of carbs per hour now and kind of are able to absorb that through training. Obviously, that higher intensity means they are burning more carbs per hour. But yeah, there's that research to support the training effect of the gut.
And just picking up on that question that Mel asked about for the team Hesperides who's doing Chase the Sun, do you think it's ideal for her to try and see if there is a way she can have a meal halfway through, or look at a strategy that combines, she's talked about a cube of cereal bar every 20 minutes and then actually supplementing that with fluids, so drinks that have carbs and electrolytes. So I think she's kind of saying, I'm not sure if I should be trying to find a way to eat a meal, or do you think the strategy that I've kind of used in the past for shorter rides will see me through that sort of that Chase the Sun ride, which is 200 miles?
Yeah, and energy-wise, that's sort of, that little and often with perhaps a piece of cereal bar, or obviously we recommend the Pocket Rocket for some of those every 15 to 20 minutes, a little block, and that's some, easily digestible, fast-acting energy. They can, energy-wise, probably get you through that. The potential drawback is if she just becomes fed up of eating the same thing, or if she becomes dehydrated, that's another problem, because that slows down the body's absorption rate.
Yeah,
the body can't absorb that energy as quickly from the intestines, and then you're going to start to feel that energy deficit and really struggle. So maintaining good hydration really underpins this whole thing. A carbohydrate drink, as she mentioned, it can be really convenient, especially on the bike. You've got perhaps 2 bottle cages, perhaps more, but at least one of those can be a carbohydrate rich drink. So it's really easy to kind of keep sipping on and keep that little and often carbohydrate supply going.
I think one of the big challenges, particularly with endurance events, is that it's actually really hard to replicate the time in the saddle, the time on the trails or in the lake that you're actually going to do for the events. Often people find out what they can and can't tolerate during the event. So I guess one of the things that we're going to be looking at with the team Hesperides is trying to really create a bit of a target kind of nutrition food list, so things that they can try and practice with, see what actually they can tolerate. So there's some choices maybe during the event, because I'm guessing if she has a bit of a sensitive stomach and actually spends the best part of many hours taking on sports nutrition, her gut might actually start to react to that as well over time. So I guess maybe trying to practice with different food types, as you said, just to get a sense of what could work. I know, Mel, for example, on Chase the Sun, you found that actually you couldn't tolerate the cappuccino anymore. It was actually the milk, it was the lactose in the milk that you realised actually wasn't working for you. You'd leave the cafe stop and there'd always be, so you started taking that out and you could see the difference. So lots of trial and error, I think, on that.
But I guess the
Definitely.
important point is test, test, and test again. And just a couple more on the carbs before we move on to other questions is I don't normally eat a lot of carbs, so guessing I need to increase these training increases. Yes, tick.
Yeah.
I think that's 100%. I try to avoid ultra-processed food, and we've talked a little bit about that because of the sensitivity, and I don't tend to use gels. Any other advice in terms of what she can consume? My thoughts would be find rich foods that have the level of carbohydrates et al. And again, practice. Are there any magic foods out there that you would suggest that aren't ultra-processed?
In terms of some kind of natural food options that are carbohydrate rich, bananas are great. I've known some people do little batches of boiled potatoes, perhaps with a little bit of salt to replace some of the sodium that you'd be sweating out. So that's another good carb source. Flapjacks, another one, or even jam sandwiches. Depends how. I don't think the jam is ultra processed, but there's obviously, there's sugar in there, which is refined. In terms of, gels have got some ultra processed ingredients in there. The Pocket Rocket uses refined cane sugar, so it's refined in that sense, but it's not really deemed ultra processed, and that can be a really convenient way to carry a lot of energy without carrying a lot of weight. So in terms of, you can get 45 grams of carbs from a 47 gram bar, whereas a jam sandwich, I think you'd be probably looking at more like 30 to 40 grams of carbs for a sandwich that perhaps weighs 80 to 90 grams, just a ballpark there with a couple of slices of bread.
Yeah, I mean, I lived on VOOM bars for my Ironman, and it really worked. And bananas, actually, it was a good combo. And actually, what I find really works is actually using the VOOM bars between feed stations, particularly for kind of running events. So it's light, it's easy to carry, I can keep my fuel levels kind of topped up. But then when I get to a feed station, I've kind of already tested those target foods, already tested what kind of foods that tend to be at the feed stations can I tolerate. So I kind of tend to use those as a bit more of the real food kind of options. So I think that the VOOM bars do definitely pack a punch, and I find them just very easy to digest. I can understand why if that's all you ate. So, I'm going to be doing Ultra Trail Snowdonia. So that's the cutoff time is, I think, 36 hours. So there is the potential to be out for a very long time. So trying to find that kind of balance is quite hard. Somebody else has just asked, I'd love to have some advice on carb loading. I've read so much stuff on avoiding too much fibre right before a race, and I'm unsure how that fits in with an increase in carbs during that time. So I guess it's this slight confusion of I need to carb load, but I don't need to stimulate my gut in negative ways.
Yes, yeah. So essentially the idea of carb loading is that by increasing how much carbohydrate we're consuming in the 2 or 3 days before an event, we can actually get the body to store a little bit more carbohydrate than normal, which is then going to be used as energy come the time of the event. So this tends to be, there's kind of a range of recommendations, but 8 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight is a kind of a ballpark figure. So as a kind of example, if we say I'm an 80 kilogram person, that range would be 80 times 8 is...
If you're not watching this, he's got his old-fashioned calculator out. There we go. It's a good old Casio.
So 640 grams, which sounds an awful lot, but that can be spread over that 2 or 3 day period. But the misconception is people think carb loading, I just need to eat more of everything. And that's not the case. It's more about manipulating the kind of the balance. So perhaps having to reduce slightly your fat intake and perhaps a little bit your protein intake to stick with a similar kind of number of calories per day, but more grams of carbohydrate. Yeah, the day-to-day, there's a lot of support for whole grain carb sources. In this period, they tend to be higher in fibre, which is perhaps best to minimise your fibre intake, as we mentioned earlier, for that kind of stomach comfort. So perhaps your white bread, your white pasta, your white rice, rather than the whole grains that you might normally enjoy. Potatoes are not huge, especially if they're peeled, and not hugely fibre rich. And then one other consideration that I think we're going to come on to, the weight thing a little bit. Now, I don't really subscribe to weighing yourself every day. I know some people do that. So just a point for perhaps some of those people. As you start to consume these extra carbohydrates and store them, the body will store a little bit more water as well with them. So you may naturally see some sort of weight gain, perhaps up to 1 to 2 kilograms. The body can store as extra water. That extra weight as such is not deemed negative for performance. You'll kind of as you burn through the carbs, you'll kind of lose some of that water weight as you go. And the benefit of those topped up carb stores actually outweigh the kind of the potential. You could argue, I'm a bit heavier, I might not be able to go up this hill quite as quickly. But that's outweighed by the benefit of having those carbohydrate stores.
Does that water storage, Bo, have a positive impact on hydration and actually just how much fluid is actually stored in the body?
I don't believe it does, because it's kind of, in effect, tied up in the process of storing those carbohydrates within the muscles and the liver. So it's not kind of available to go into the other cells of the body and the kind of the body's water reservoir as such. So yeah, there's another good point, because whilst you're up in those carbohydrate stores, you also want to be ensuring you're well hydrated at the same time.
Yeah, I think hydration is massively underrated. The experiences that I've seen is where people have actually got dehydrated quite quickly without realizing, and then actually aren't able to take on food because they don't feel like it, the gut's not responding, and it becomes a bit of a spiral. And we'll come on to hydration in a minute. Just before we kind of move on, back to the carbohydrate, because I think there are obviously carbohydrates come in lots of different forms. So I think about carbohydrate from a day-to-day nutrition point of view as nutritionally rich carbohydrates. So, the grains, the pulses, and everything else. And I think this is maybe where people get a little bit confused, and particularly around sort of everyday kind of nutrition versus kind of fueling for your endurance. Can you just give just a few examples of what you would call sort of day-to-day good carbs? And I'm putting that in inverted commas, but I guess more nutritious carbs. And then the type of carbs that actually, if you're looking to fuel pre a race or during a race, the kind of thing. So I always think about beige food versus sort of white food versus more colourful kind of food. So you just maybe just demystify that a little, so people just really get their heads around the different types of carbs, because it's a really big part of our daily intake.
Yeah. So in effect, there's two main groups of carbohydrates. So your shorter chain carbohydrates and your longer chain carbohydrates, which are more complex. So those sort of polysaccharides take a bit longer to digest in the body. So whilst they're good day to day, and even in the couple of days before an event, they can help build up the stores of carbohydrate in the body. Actually, during the event, you want something that the body can use a bit more quickly, which is why the shorter chain, which are kind of often more simple sugars, is perhaps how they would be more commonly known. They can actually be a lot more easily used in the body, and more quickly used in the body. And then I guess the other thing is that the longer chain carbohydrates in, for example, rice and oats are often accompanied by a bit more fiber. So that's potentially one to avoid in the couple of days prior to an event. But day to day, it's less of an issue, and they can be quite healthy to take.
Sorry, Mel, I just want to ask just a quick follow-up on the carbs. I know it's a bit technical, but where does fruit and veg fit in the whole carb conversation?
Yeah, so different fruit and veg have varying carbohydrate contents. Often, like bananas and apples are known to be fairly carbohydrate rich, and that's normally a fructose, which is basically a type of simple carbohydrate molecule. Vegetables, typically, there's quite a wide variation in the carb content. So, for example, potatoes are going to have quite a good carb content, down to perhaps a lettuce. There's next to no carbohydrate in there. So, yeah, I think
Holly learned that when she was adapting from her carbs are evil phase to going out on a bike ride, and very quickly. So she comes out on a bike ride and she's had a salad for lunch, but it's okay. It had croutons on it.
I was going to say it had croutons. I thought that was my carbohydrate.
Yeah, so she bonked about maybe an hour in, and we all just stood there and kind of laughed and went, well, welcome to the world of carbohydrates and the importance that carbohydrate plays as a fueling mechanism. And it's quite interesting. As a question that someone said, I'd love some advice on fueling during Eden 5-mile bike ride. I presume she's doing Chase the Sun. How often and what would be suggested? So we talked about the pre. She's done everything great nutritionally. She comes to the event. At what stage do you start to fuel, and how often? My take on it is I always eat little and often, and definitely 45 minutes in is when I start to think, okay, that breakfast or that food that I've had is now starting to become depleted. I need to top it up. Is that a good strategy? What are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, definitely. The little and often is really useful from a strategy to follow. If you kind of do the opposite and do perhaps every hour, you could just have if you're aiming for 60 grams of carbs, just drop that all in, at the end of each hour. And what essentially will happen in the body is all that carbohydrate will hit the stomach in one go, and the body recognizes there's a high concentration of carbs and actually draws in water to dilute that to then help it be absorbed. But that process of drawing in the water can make you feel quite bloated, and it fills the stomach up. If you're running, it can give you that sloshing feeling that you get. So little and often allows the body to kind of keep absorbing those carbohydrates as you keep feeding them into the digestive system. In terms of when to start fueling, personally, I recommend if you're going to fuel, say, try and have something every 15 to 20 minutes, I'd recommend doing that right from the start. The reason being, yes, you've had a good carb-rich breakfast and you've carb-loaded the days before, so you are fine. You have enough energy to probably go for an hour and a half, whilst you're kind of gradually depleting what's stored. If you then start replacing things when you're already quite depleted, you kind of refilling the tank when it's quite near the bottom. It to kind of use a fuel tank analogy, let's say. Whereas if you can start fueling while the tank's still quite full, you still are going to gradually deplete, but you're really going to slow that rate down. So you're probably going to be able to maintain a slightly higher intensity throughout your event or challenge, or just feel a little bit more energized. It's not the end of the world if you kind of wait to that 45-minute mark. Yeah, it probably works. A lot of people do follow that kind of strategy. But again, it's back to that testing what works for you.
I often think that hunger is not a particularly reliable friend on events. And I often think for myself, when I've got to the point of being hungry, and I did a 26-mile trail run in the Lake District 2 weekends ago, and I remember getting to a point thinking, I'm hungry now, so I've kind of missed my fueling. I've not actually paid enough attention because I've actually got to the point where I'm hungry. I think I had about 3 bits of VOOM bar in one go, and it actually took the hunger away. So very quickly, very easily, I was able to get some fuel in. But is that true, Bo? Is hunger maybe a sign that actually you're a bit behind in your fueling?
Most likely, yes. I would caveat that by saying if you're perhaps using a carbohydrate drink, so you're kind of taking most of your energy on in liquid form, or gels, or even piece of the pocket rocket, quite simple sugars, you may kind of be fueling the body quite well in terms of delivering carbs and glucose into the bloodstream. But because there's kind of not that much content in your stomach, you might start to feel hungry. But yeah, I'd say often if you're kind of a little bit behind on your fueling and you start to feel hungry, that the answer kind of lies there. And even more so on thirst, the thirst reflex is normally triggered when you're already 1% or so dehydrated. So in effect, you're then playing catch up, trying to get back to a good hydration level. If you've kind of started to feel thirsty, it's probably a little bit late.
Yeah, and on that fluid side, isn't it quite a stark statistic? If you are, isn't it, dehydrated to a certain level, then you can be losing up to 5+% in terms of kind of performance. Just set that out from a bit of context. I'm thirsty, I'm dehydrated. How much of a big effect does that have on me?
You're probably, when you start to feel thirsty, around 1% dehydrated, and there's quite a few studies have shown at 2% dehydration level, yeah, you can have a 5 to 10%, sometimes even 20% reduction in your performance, be that running speed or power output when you're cycling. So kind of trying to hydrate before you reach those losses is quite important. There's an argument, and I believe a term called functional dehydration, which is kind of to some extent a little bit of fluid loss, makes you a little bit lighter, and then perhaps you could cycle up a hill more quickly. That is kind of these very fine margins in perhaps the Tour de France when it's a mountain finish. So yes, you gradually becoming a little bit dehydrated, but you don't have to project to carry on doing your activity for another 2, 3, 4, however many hours. It's the end of the stage is coming. So dehydrating a little bit is not such a problem because then you can rehydrate in the finish in the recovery area.
And Bo, obviously a lot of ladies at Team Hesperitt are doing quite long endurance events. So it's quite likely that we'll all find ourselves at a place where we do get a bit dehydrated and we need to try and find a way to correct that. Is there a way to correct that? Or is it a case of once you become dehydrated, it becomes very difficult to reverse that cycle?
No, you can certainly kind of reverse that and rehydrate the body, and that's where electrolytes are going to become really important. If you are a bit dehydrated and think you realise either you're thirsty or you've been to the bathroom and notice your urine's quite dark, it's another sign that you're dehydrated. You start downing a load of water. What's likely to happen is you'll just pass most of that water. You'll absorb a little bit, but the body sees that and thinks, if I bring that into the body, I'm going to further deplete the electrolyte contents that I naturally have in the body. So it doesn't want too much plain water. So it allows that to pass through, and you're going to end up needing to go to the bathroom again. You've not actively hydrated yourself that much, even though you go into the bathroom. If you can consume an electrolyte drink, that's going to really help the body absorb that water and those electrolytes into the body. And in the presence of a little bit of glucose as well, that can be absorbed even more quickly from the intestines. So the fastest hydration or rehydration is a hypotonic drink. So that's where there's some salt and some sugars, but at a lower concentration than in the blood. So, for example, the VOOM Hydrate Smart drink is hypotonic, meaning when you drink that, that's going to drive really fast fluid uptake to rehydrate the body and replenish some of those electrolytes that you're kind of naturally losing in your sweat as you're cycling along or running or whatever the event is.
Yeah, and just to close on the fluid piece before we go back to that conversation around weight and obviously food consumption, it's a question for a swimmer. Obviously, we have lots of amazing women that are taking on long swimming events. And her question is around that she did Windermere last year and she thinks she did okay from a nutritional point of view, but she definitely didn't drink enough, and it's really hard to be able to drink. And I can echo that from the time that I did Windermere. How much should I be drinking? Ideally an hour on a long swim, and I'm sure that's the same for any kind of activity. What are your thoughts? Is it 750 mils an hour you should be consuming in terms of fluid?
750 mils is probably on the upper end for quite a lot of people, of kind of a balance of what's practical and what's beneficial. So 400 to 500 mil, there's a lot of factors go into this. There's kind of the conditions of the event, how warm it is, how humid it is, perhaps if you're running. I know if you're swimming, perhaps you're in a wetsuit, which actually ends up, you sweat more than you realise inside there because the body is feeling quite warm. Or it may be the opposite. You may be non-wetsuit, it's quite cold, you're not sweating so much. So your personal sweat rate really contributes to how much you need to try and replenish per hour. A ballpark, 400 to 600 millilitres is probably quite a good aim. For practicality, that might be lower. On, say, a swimming event, on the bike, you've got the opportunity to carry the bottle, so you can perhaps get to that 600 or perhaps even 750 mils per hour. Certainly, it's a balance. Again, you're not really going to be able to replenish and absorb everything that you lose in sweat, but you're trying to minimize the dehydration level over time. So again, it's projecting that forward. So depending how long you're going to be out for, if you're only going to be out for a couple of hours, you can probably afford to perhaps have, I don't know, let's say 500 to 1,000 milliliters of deficit by the end of the event, which means you could perhaps get away with only taking 200 or 300 mils per hour for those couple of hours. If it's a 10-hour event, you don't really want to be building much deficit hour on hour, because you've obviously got more hours to try and get to the end of without a large deficit. But yeah, I think sort of some level of experimentation, if it's possible, you can kind of estimate a fluid loss per hour for yourself by weighing yourself before and after a training session. You likely will lose weight during that time unless you've consumed, you need to minus what you consume. So if I go out for 2 hours and come back 1 kilogram lighter, we can say that's 1,000 mil I've lost, but I drank 500 mils in that time. So my fluid loss was effectively 1.5 litres, so 750 mils per hour. So you can kind of do a calculation that way to try and estimate your fluid losses, but obviously you need to, where possible, try and replicate the conditions as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Bo, just a couple more questions, 2 or 3 different questions on the same theme. Slightly different reasons people are asking it, but people are concerned around too many sugary-based foods, I guess things like bars and gels, and are looking for savoury alternatives. I know you've mentioned a couple of things just earlier on around jam sandwiches and sort of potatoes. Are there any other sort of recommendations you can make around savoury alternatives?
Yeah, so we've kind of discussed several times the kind of getting that balance of sort of supplements and real food. So there's kind of more real food options that are savoury, and more of the supplements tend to be sweeter with kind of faster acting simple sugars. Within the VOOM range, we have developed a couple of more savoury options. So our beetroot bar range, which is an oat-based cold pressed bar, with beetroots, freeze dried fruit, and some coconut oil in there that sort of binds it all together. There's some level of kind of simple sugars there that naturally come from the fruit juice that's in the bar and the freeze dried fruit. But there's also slower release carbohydrates from the oats. So that's going to give you sustained energy. So they're less sweet to taste, but they're also kind of, in terms of the perhaps the negative connotation of sugar, of that fast insulin response, there's going to be less of that because they're kind of more steadily and more gradually absorbed into the body. And then kind of beyond that, we've developed a savoury energy drink, which we call our Sparta Fuel. This is kind of ideally aimed at ultra distance, so when people are going longer and they need some element of protein intake as well. So there's about a 4-to-1 ratio of carbs to protein. But the carbohydrate source we use in there is a fibrous carbohydrate source called isomaltose, which is essentially a long chain carbohydrate. So it's broken down more steadily in the body and kind of gives sustained energy over a longer period. So that again is going to avoid that big glucose spike, rapid spike in blood glucose levels. And in terms of the actual taste, it's a tomato and red pepper flavour, so it's a real savoury taste. So if people are just fed up of too many sweet things, it can really kind of tick that box as well.
I need to try that for my Ultra Trail Snowdonia in a couple of months. Just a very quick question actually related to diabetes. One of our members has just been told by the doctor that she's pre-diabetic and is concerned obviously about trying to reduce the number of sugary foods in her diet. How do you think she should approach training? Because the balance isn't there between, I guess, everyday nutrition, which you're going to be doing the vast majority of the time, versus your training and event. And I guess the question I'm asking is, should her focus be around the diet sort of every day and not worry so much about the sugars when she's either doing the specific training or particularly the long distance training, maybe the long rides or the long runs? I know she's training for a 70.3 triathlon, so she'll have lots of those kind of in there. So any advice for her on just how she can just manage it and not feel concerned, I guess, about maybe consuming some of those simple sugars when she maybe will most need it, either on event day or training?
Yeah, I think relying on some carb-rich sort of real food options, the bananas and perhaps bits of flapjack or these sorts of sandwiches and things we talked about, they can be kind of a good starting point. In terms of kind of day-to-day following that kind of lower sugar diet and then suddenly including them for event day, you perhaps don't know exactly how the body's going to respond. And in terms of like a diabetic or pre-diabetic state, it's perhaps something I'd recommend speaking to a trained medical professional on that point. I think while the body's exercising, there's kind of the body is using glucose from the blood. So putting some simple sugars and glucose into the body shouldn't be a huge problem. But obviously, on that diabetic side, over time, people tend to become quite well attuned to what they can take and how much they can take and exactly how that affects their own blood glucose level.
Yeah, it's again, it's very complex, isn't it? But hopefully what we've been able to do so far is educate people to understand, what good looks like and some great examples. And to finish, there's been a lot of questions around fueling and weight, which is obviously a very female specific conversation and definitely something across cycling. And I'll start with the first question, and there's very much a theme in the others. I need to lose a bit of fat to help with my goals, so I'm trying to balance training, having enough fuel, and being in a slight deficit. I'm also vegetarian, so it is my day-to-day I need advice with as well on event day. So first question, do the two go together? As in training for an endurance event and trying to lose weight, are they compatible? Yes or no?
Yes, they are definitely
Okay.
compatible, and I think it's what you put the focus on. I would recommend focusing more on the training for the event, and there's likely to be a sort of a slight reduction. I saw some of the questions come in, people want to lose weight. I think it's not weight that they kind of actually want to lose in terms of their mass on the scales, it's probably a bit of body fat to kind of manipulate the composition of the body. So to have slightly higher muscle, not more muscle, but kind of a higher proportion of the body being muscle or fat-free mass is probably the actual aim. So having a little bit of deficit day to day, it's a fine balance because as we've talked about several times, you need to fuel the body, you need carbohydrates. And this kind of timing of when you take those carbohydrates can be one way to manipulate. So if you finish the day in a slight deficit, people talk about up to 500 calories per day as kind of a deficit to lose weight over time. I personally would think closer to 200 to 300 calories per day, certainly if you're trying to follow a structured training plan at that time.
And I guess with that, Bo, really understanding what you are eating now to then understand what's your current calorie intake, what's your calorie expenditure, I guess, with the exercise. And if you're trying to find that fine balance, you're probably going to have to get a little bit granular and a little bit technical about those numbers. So rather than vaguely trying to work out, well, if I eat a bit less of this, or if I don't eat that bit of carb after training, then I might lose some weight. I think, as you say, it's a fine balance. And I guess really trying to understand what your numbers look like now and trying to kind of manage that kind of loss. And I guess if people will have to experiment a little bit, won't they? Because if they're very, very hungry, or they're seeing a performance drop, or they're finding they just can't complete those longer training sessions, then it's probably suggesting that the balance is maybe not quite right yet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm not a huge fan of these apps that kind of track everything you eat. But you do need to try and get a handle on your kind of, what's your current daily diet in terms of how much carbs, how much protein, how much fat am I taking on? And then how many total calories does that roughly equate to? And then perhaps you're going to manipulate that down ever so slightly. And the other thing is, if you're on lighter training days, those are probably slightly better days to have that deficit. If you know you've got a big training day, perhaps kind of aiming to take on almost the same calories as you might expect to burn is probably really useful in terms of being able to complete that session in a healthy way. Prolonged energy deficit, i.e. you're not consuming enough and not having enough energy ready for the body to do what you're asking it. There's kind of a range of health concerns to doing that for a prolonged period. For example, reducing bone mineral density is one. So yeah, it's kind of being careful, and I think working with a trained nutritionist can be really beneficial here, because you're kind of wanting to get to quite, as you say, quite a granular level of exactly what you're eating and when and how much.
Yeah, and I guess that those health, if you are in a deficit over a long period of time, then as you said, it can lead to some of those concerning health conditions. So something that's talked about quite a bit is something called REDS, which is something relative energy deficit syndrome, which actually happens to men and women, but it's quite prevalent in women, isn't it? As an issue.
Yeah, and that's basically, as we talked about, not having enough energy available to the body at the time it needs it. So it might be perhaps you have an evening meal, a good balanced meal, and then you go to sleep and you get up in the morning, you don't have any breakfast because you're going for an early training session. At that point, the body will become into an energy deficit because it's not consumed enough carbohydrates recently enough to kind of fuel that. So sometimes the timing of when you have your carbs and your meals can help. So eating slightly earlier in the day on average and not having a large meal in the evening can be a way to kind of make sure you're fueling your training and your sessions, but perhaps ending up in that little bit of deficit that some people kind of want to work towards.
Yeah, and I think your point about sort of body composition is probably quite key, isn't it? Because the scales don't always give you the whole picture. It's one number, isn't it? But it doesn't actually tell you much unless you have body composition scales. It tells you actually, and I guess the aim is to reduce that kind of fat. Now, I've talked quite openly a lot. I've shared a video with some of the ladies around this whole issue around weight. When I sort of first met Mel 8 years ago, I was definitely one of those people that was on a constant diet. So the whole reductionist kind of food, how can I eat as little as possible at breakfast, lunch, and then probably starving at dinner, and probably a bit more than I probably should do there. And that kind of being a repetitive cycle. And I started training to do Mount Von 2-3 ways on a bike, which is about 12 hours basically. And that was my first baptism of fire that Mel took me on. Absolutely loved it. And then signed up for a 70.3 distance triathlon. But for me, actually, what changed for me wasn't to focus on weight loss. It was actually Mel kind of guiding me on what good nutrition, high nutritionally valuable food was. So it was actually changing the composition of what was on my plate every single day. And then actually, because I was doing more and more training, because I was being structured, I was doing those longer rides and runs and swims for the different events, I actually just lost weight without trying to diet. I was actually eating, and I now eat way more than I've ever eaten in my whole 48 years. I was trying to count them up, but it's true. And it's really hard for people to maybe it's so counterintuitive, but actually for me, it was much more about what I was eating and the composition of that day to day. It was just better quality carbohydrates and the right kind of number of carbohydrates, protein, and a little bit of kind of healthier fats. I mean, I never ate processed food. I don't really like takeaways because I often think they taste crap when you get them home and you might as well just go and sit in the restaurant. So, it wasn't that I was eating loads of processed food. I was probably just eating an excess of sugar, actually, that was carbohydrates, but sugar, because I was having fruit and yogurt for breakfast and I was having it for lunch. And if I was really treating myself, I'd have a bit of granola on top, which was probably loaded with sugar. So I probably swapped actually a whole bunch of sugar and low fat type things for just really good quality nutritional kind of food. And, that did include burger and beer, by the way, but I think I lost about just under a stone, probably over that 3 or 4 months of training by just focusing on that. So there's lots of ways to it. And I guess dieting, as you say, it's quite problematic in lots of different ways.
Yeah, I think there's a mental side to that as well. It feels hard because it's diet is almost a restrictive word. You're restricting, you're depriving the body of some level of energy that it needs. So if you can think more about fueling the activity that you want to do in the day, but then because over time, if you're working towards a Chase the Sun, or 70.3 triathlon, or maybe it's just a local 10K, if you're building up your training, you're going to be burning more calories day to day. So you think about fueling that, but over time, you most likely will lose a little bit of body fat, as you attest to there.
Yeah. And Holly is now no longer a sinner. She is somebody who's spent a lot of time, obviously, kind of understanding that. And just before we close, the protein element, and again, people, especially women, think it's really important because it's very topical, which it is. Protein and recovery. What role does protein play in recovery? And are there any other elements in there, such as creatine or any other supplements that you think are a really vital part of training and recovery?
Yeah, it's a good question. Protein's obviously got a lot of attention more recently, and it's the benefits of consuming enough protein are quite prevalent. In terms of recovery, the role it's going to do is going to help repair muscle tissues, which are damaged to some extent during exercise. So it's going to repair and rebuild those. If you are looking to build more muscle, your protein intake is going to help. The protein is the building blocks to build that muscle and the muscle tissue. So yeah, in terms of recovery, it's important to try and consume as soon as you can after you've kind of finished your exercise. And people talk about this golden 30 to 60 minute window. It's not one of those things that's, if you go outside an hour after you've done your exercise, it's the end of the world. But that's when the body is kind of most receptive to absorbing those macronutrients, and when protein synthesis is kind of elevated, so that's going to help repair those muscle tissues.
Does that mean that you can eat chocolate in that 36 and it's free? I say it's free calories during that hour. Is that right?
To some extent,
yes. No,
I wouldn't say it's free calories, but yeah, the body is kind of working at a higher metabolic rate in response to the exercise you've just done. So you're burning more calories per hour. Chocolate itself is not protein rich. So it's not going to kind of help repair and rebuild the muscles. The carb content of it can help, because carbohydrates are another part of recovery, can help replenish the body's glycogen stores, the carb stores in the body. But chocolate milk is a really good recovery option. I think I saw one of the questions somebody asked about kind of homemade options to kind of boost recovery, and chocolate milk is one of the most popular there, because it's got the protein and it's got some carbs. Another kind of homemade recovery option I like is I just make my own banana milkshake in the blender, just with milk and 1 or 2 bananas. Sometimes add a scoop of just plain protein powder to that, which will kind of up your protein intake a little bit, but it's still quite a natural recovery shake.
I add a bit of yogurt as well sometimes to those, which is quite nice.
Yes.
Extra bit of protein in there.
Yeah.
What about that's good for you as well, right? Chocolate ice cream.
Chocolate ice cream would take normal milk to chocolate milk, wouldn't it? I suppose. Yeah, no, it's a dairy based product, so and dairy is kind of known to be a good protein source as well.
Yep. Right, Bo, we have a last couple of quick fire questions for you. So we've pretty much gone through, I think, the conversation around what kind of good nutrition looks like day to day, and then explored lots of different elements around people's training, event day, how to recover. And I've got a couple of last questions, a little bit around supplements and supplementation, this particularly in the context of women who are perimenopausal, particularly where strength and obviously losing muscle mass is a potential issue. And obviously it's a really important kind of element. What's your thoughts on creatine? Yes or no?
Yes, for a wide variety of reasons and for a wide variety of people, from kind of perhaps young people focused maybe on strength or endurance. There's benefits for both. And then as we kind of age and, as you say, there's a risk of reducing muscle mass, which kind of naturally happens over time. Creatine can be a really good supplement to kind of minimize the effect of that. So it's kind of, in terms of how much, the recommendation is 3 to 5 grams of the supplement per day. We get a small amount of creatine naturally in the diet from like red meat and some dairy products and animal milk. But yeah, supplementation can be really beneficial. In terms of getting kind of, initially you may need to supplement with more, 10 to 20 grams per day over a period of 5 to 7 days to kind of really saturate the body's creatine stores, and then a maintenance of that 3 to 5 grams per day. And yeah, there's a lot of research on this. It supports endurance, performance, strength, and building muscle, either maintaining muscle. It kind of depends on, yes, the dose, but also if you just take a load of creatine every day and sit on the sofa, you're not going to build a load of muscle. It goes hand in hand with the training stimulus that you give the body. If you're doing a load of strength training and resistance training, perhaps you will see some muscle growth, or you perhaps will just maintain the muscle mass for longer through that aging process.
Great, thanks, Bo. And I'm an advocate of creatine. I definitely think it helped me through some of my Ironman training and some of my bigger endurance events. Magnesium, what's your thoughts on magnesium?
Yeah, so not quite as much as creatine, but there's some good research supporting magnesium in terms of aiding sleep and even reducing some anxiety as well. So it's, again, one that we get naturally in our diet. Leafy green vegetables like kale and spinach, broccoli are good sources, as are quite a few nuts and seeds, pumpkin seeds, almonds, cashews are all kind of natural sources of magnesium, but you may wish to supplement that further. And yeah, I think it can aid recovery by improving quality of sleep. So in effect, you may go to bed for 8 hours. If you have more deep sleep in that time, the body can repair and regenerate itself more fully. So it's kind of a recovery tool in that instance as well.
Oh, magnesium, definitely might be looking at that. I guess if you get it within your daily diet, it may not be such an issue to supplement outside of that, because is there any such thing as too much magnesium?
There is at some point, but it's not really consideration that you're going to
come across
on an everyday diet, even if you're perhaps taking a magnesium capsule daily as well. There's a recommended daily amount. I can't remember the figure off the top of my head, but you would need to be multiple times over that before there's any concern.
Now, to end our marathon nutrition set of questions, Bo, you have done well. You must have hydrated on VOOM to get through the last hour with us. It's very technical, so let's hope this comes out right and you know the answer, because I certainly don't know the answer. Somebody's saying they keep being baffled by monohydrates, citrates, and whether you then also need zinc or other vitamins to help absorption.
And so this is not perhaps my area of expertise. The general advice on vitamins is that naturally occurring vitamins, so in your diet, in things like meats and vegetables, they're a lot more easy to absorb than supplementation. I think there is some research that shows you need some zinc to absorb vitamin D, I believe it is. You naturally will have a small amount of zinc from your diet, but if you're looking to supplement vitamin D, certainly in the winter months here in the UK, that can be beneficial. And yes, you can look to supplement with some zinc alongside that. I think some kind of capsules that you just buy from the supermarket will have some level of zinc in there as well as like a combination.
Yeah, thanks, Bo, and thank you for your time. Obviously, as chief nutritionist, you have done very, very well. And we're always grateful for yours, Callum's, and the rest of the team at VOOM's support. And if I reflect and summarise my learnings from this, is a good balanced diet day in, day out is critical. The role that carbohydrates play day in, day out is again kind of really, really important on so many different levels. Practice makes perfect. So make sure that you eat what you think that you're going to eat and consume. And lastly, the role that fluid has to play. I think fluid is often forgotten, especially in the swimming world. I see so many people swimming over an hour and don't have a bottle of fluid on the poolside, and definitely don't consume it when they do kind of big swims. Would that be a good reflection of everything that we've spoken about in the last hour?
Yeah, I think that summarizes
I've got
it
the job.
nicely.
Yes.
And it only took you a minute to say it rather than it took me an hour.
Well, I think like everything, it's more complex than it sounds on the outside, isn't it? Sort of, I think once people get their heads round the basics, and that's why we wanted to kind of cover what does good look like for daily fueling, and then also fueling for endurance events, then you then start to ask lots of multiple questions. And we've got some brilliant Herspiritors here doing some phenomenal events and all wanting to try and kind of do their best. Thanks, Bo. You've done an incredible job, and we can't wait to share this with the team. And I'm sure there'll be some other questions that will come from it.
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you very much for having me. And I will, if I may just reiterate, I've not mentioned, obviously, yeah, a balance of real foods at the right times and then some supplements to kind of support that, and perhaps some energy supplements, energy bars. So from the kind of the VOOM product range, we've mentioned a few of the products. Just a reminder, there's the HerSpirit12 code, discount code for the VOOM website, for people who are wanting to either try the products or stock up. And I'm sure kind of that's shared out regularly anyway.
Yeah, 100%. And I have definitely become a VOOM consumer of everything, and the knowledge and expertise that you guys have given us personally and us as an organisation has been phenomenal. Thank you. Callum will give you the thumbs up. You have now gained the brand manager job as well. So congratulations on that. But yeah, Holly, I think it was an amazing conversation, wasn't it?
Yeah, great conversation. And I think there's lots of fuel for thought for everyone. I know.
Very nice.
Terrible, isn't it? I know, but no, brilliant conversation. And it's great to have such fantastic expertise and the support of Bo and the team at VOOM. So thank you. See you soon.
Thanks, ta-ra.